So tape number 65 starts this evening. And if you recall from last time, brothers and sisters, we've come to the 12th chapter of the Apocalypse. We've seen that it is an enlargement and an explanation in greater detail of what we found in the 6th chapter under the 6th seal. And we come to the point in verse 14 that to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent. And we looked at Deuteronomy chapter 28 and at verse 49 at the conclusion of last time's class to see how the eagle was emblematic of the Roman power. Now, just to refresh our minds, Rome by this time had obviously undergone a change. It had changed from paganism to pseudo-Christianity. Emperor Constantine had come to the fore as champion of the Christian cause. But as we stressed last time, Rome still remained the world's powerfulest empire. Although it had changed its religious base, it was still an all-powerful, conquering empire. And Constantine was no less ruthless than the emperors which had gone before him or who succeeded him. It should have done. Christianity, even in a watered-down form, should have had effect upon this man, but history testifies that it didn't. And so the woman in verse 14, who had given birth to this man-child, was now taken into the wilderness, into a place where she was to be nourished at times and time and half a time from the face of the serpent. Now, you recall that we said from Deuteronomy that the eagle was emblematic of Rome. Now, if that was the case, it's generally been acknowledged that if we can imagine, and I'm not saying this literally obviously, I'm just trying to take a symbol, that if Rome was the centre of the empire, i.e. the brain, the thinking part, the head of the eagle, Italy, the country, was the body of the eagle. The idea of the 2 wings was spanning to the very extremities of the empire. And that's how one writer has described this empire of Rome, as the great eagle, with its head, its headquarters in Rome itself, with the body of the eagle in Italy, and the 2 wings, the great span of an eagle, going to the very extremities of the Roman Empire, which, don't forget, covered the whole of the then known world. And so this woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle that she might fly into the wilderness. And the general understanding is that the woman obviously went to the very extremities of the Roman Empire in the wilderness, both literally and spiritually, so that she is nourished for that period of time from the face of the serpent. And we ask the question, why? And we already know the answer. And it was all to do with the African controversy, which we considered under the 6th seal. We briefly referred to it again last week, that although he had been brought to power as the champion of the Christian cause, Constantine very soon had to take sides. And he took sides over a particular matter which became known as the African controversy. And he issued an edict which demanded that everybody agreed with what he had given forth as a command. And if they didn't, then they would be excommunicated and persecuted. Again, Gibbon gives us the details which we quoted when dealing with the 6th seal. And so this woman found herself in a dilemma. The very Christian community which had given him his power, his seat, and his great authority was now being obviously challenged, persecuted by this same man. Now remember, it wouldn't have been all. It would have only been that section of the community which opposed the edict which he gave forth. He obviously had many supporters in the particular problem which existed at that time. But for the rest of the Christian community who didn't agree, who protested against the edict, had to flee for their very lives. Now amongst the woman community, we find at the end of verse 17 was the true ecclesia. We shall come to that a little later. But you'll notice the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So part of this woman community who protested concerning the matter which Constantine had made his decree about contained the true ecclesia of God. And they became existent only in the uttermost regions of the Roman Empire, where they were supported by that described in verse 16 as the earth. And we saw that, did we not, in chapter 11 with the two witnesses. But we'll tie that up in a second. And you'll notice in verse 14, she was to be sustained there for that period of time, of a time, times, and half the time from the face of the serpent. Now if you remember, we have quoted before that if time periods stated in like terms will be found to relate to the same period of history and to have a common subject. Time periods stated in like terms relate to the same period of history and to have a common subject. We saw it in chapter 11, where if you recall, we'd got the 1260 days and the 42 months. And we find that although 1260 days were 42 months, because they were stated in unlike terms, they related to different periods and different subjects. So if you recall from verse 2 of chapter 11, we equated the 42 months there with what we've got in the 13th chapter and in verse 5, because we have a repetition of the idea of 42 months. Whereas the 1260 days of verse 3 we linked up with the 1260 days of verse 6 of chapter 12. Like terms relate to the same period of history and to the common subject. So time, times and a half fall into the same principle. And if we go back to Daniel chapter 7, we have the occurrence of time, times and a half previously in the Word of God. And because of that, it will give us the understanding of the time period and the subject which is being referred to. Now Daniel chapter 7 gives us the details, first of all, of the four beasts, and then in verse 8 he considered the horns on the fourth dreadful beast, and there came up among them another little horn, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots, and behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Now this beast and this horn we have identified before many times. The beast was Roman. The 10 horns were the barbaric tribes which invaded and brought the downfall of the western part. And of course this little horn which is now developing, which spoke great things against the Most High God, related to the religion, the state church, which developed out of Rome, which of course we know today as the papacy. But you'll notice in verse 19 that Daniel wanted to know the truth of this fourth beast. And he wanted to understand all the details concerning the fourth beast. And so in verse 23, we are given the explanation of this fourth beast. The fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom upon earth, which shall be diverse from all kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down and break it in pieces. And this was the great power of Rome, the legs of iron, which stamped all nations before it in order to establish the fourth world empire. It was a dreadful beast indeed. Then Daniel goes on and says, the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall arise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall do 3 kings. So verse 24 is now speaking of that little horn of verse 8. And this little horn, we are told in verse 25, would be different, it would be diverse from the others, because the others were military, they were powerful, they stamped the residue and broke it in pieces. But you'll notice the difference in this one. Verse 25. He shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given unto his hand until a time and times and the dividing of the time. But the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion, to consume it to an end, to consume and to destroy it unto the end. So Daniel gives us the bare bones of this little horn, which was to come out of the Roman power, which instead of being of military biased, was to be of a religious nature, to speak great words against the Most High, to change the calendars, to change the times and laws. And this would happen for a time, times, and the dividing of a time. The judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion, to consume it and destroy it to an end. So that's the first occurrence in Scripture of this time, times, and a dividing of the time. And it's relating to this little horn that would come out of the Roman beast. Now, before we start looking at it in detail, let's just go to chapter 12, because we have the same phraseology used in chapter 12. Remember, time periods stated in light terms relate to the same period of history and to have a common subject. And therefore, Apocalypse chapter 12 is the same as Daniel 7, is the same as Daniel 12. Verse 7. Well, we ought to put it in context. Chapter 12 is seeing, obviously, the end of all things, that Michael would stand up, the great prince, which stands for the children of his people. Many that sleep in the dust shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. And Daniel was told to shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end, because many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. And then Daniel saw on the bank of the river a man, or 2 men we would say, clothed in linen. And these 2 men were talking to one another. And the end of verse 6, the question was asked, how long shall it be to the end of these wonders? And we've got then 3 time periods given in the succeeding verses in Daniel chapter 12. And the first of these is the one we're thinking about at the moment. Verse 7 says, and I heard the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, when he had held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and swear by him that liveth for ever and ever, that it shall be for a time, times and a half, and when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. So again, the second occurrence in the Old Testament of time, times and a half. And the only other one is found in the 12th chapter of the Apocalypse, which we're thinking about at the moment. Those are the 3 time periods, stated in light terms. Therefore, they must relate to the same period of history and to have a common subject. So while we're in chapter 12, let's have a look at what this is saying. What is a time, times and a half? Well, we have no difficulty in defining that. You can turn up any history book and they will tell you that a time represents a year. Times, 2 times, are 2 years. And a half is a half a year. So we've got 1 year, 2 years and a half added together give us 3.5 years. Working on the die for the year principle, which we've established before, 3.5 years is obviously 42 months, 1260 days. 1260 days equates to the 1260 years. But it's not stated as 1260 days. It's not stated as 42 months. It's stated as a time times and a half. And the reason for that, to make sure we've understood, is although it's the same length of time, it's relating to a different time period to the 1260 days and 42 months and to a different subject. It's the same duration, but it has a different start and a different finish, and what's being discussed is also different. If we were to understand it as 42 months, like in chapter 11, it would be stated as 42 months. If we were to understand it as 1260 days, it would be stated as 1260 days. It's stated as a time times and a half, so that we may link together Daniel 7, Daniel 12, and Apocalypse 12. Those 3 time periods relate to the same period of history and to the same subject matter. So what did Daniel want to know in chapter 12? Well, he wanted to know when the end of all these things he had seen in chapter 11 and chapter 12 at the beginning of the verses, when all these things would come to an end. So he was given this first time period, a time times and a half. So would that take Daniel to the fulfillment of when Michael would stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of his people? The answer is no. How do we know that? Verse 8 tells us. I heard, but I understood not. Then said I, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? Verse 7 wasn't telling him the end of these things. And he says, Go thy way, Daniel, for thy words are closed and sealed to the time of the end. But many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wise would understand. And then he gives him 2 more time periods which would lead him towards the end of all things. But even when he's given the time period of 1,290 days and 1,335 days, it was still not the end of all things, because in verse 13 he's told, But go thy way till the end be, for thou shalt rest and stand in thy lot at the end of the days. So let's be abundantly clear, not only for our subject in hand at the moment, none of the time periods in Daniel chapter 12 will take us to the coming of Messiah. Daniel was not given the time periods which take us to the accomplishment of all things. He was given pointers along the way. He was told of dramatic events which would take place. When we saw that, then we would know the end was nigh. But even when he came to the end of the 1335 days, he was told that was not the end. Go thy way till the end be, and then thou shalt stand in the light at the end of the days. So neither the time times and a half, nor the 1290, nor the 1335 will come to the time when Michael will stand up, the great prince, for his people. But there are great pointers along the way which will shout loud and clear, he is about to arrive. So what was the first one? Verse 7. Well, the answer given is at the end of verse 7. That there would be times and a half, and when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. So at the end of verse 7 tells us the fulfillment of the times and a half. Now, we might not make a lot of sense of it in the authorized version. When he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. Now, I'll quote to you from the Jerusalem Bible, which might make a bit more clearer sense of what actually is being said. Now, as I've said again, I'm not quoting the Jerusalem because it's the version which supports what I'm going to say. I've been consistent right the way through in quoting from the Jerusalem because it just simply puts it in a more understandable way. Now, if you look at the verse in verse 7, I'll read what it says from the Jerusalem Bible. A time and 2 times and a half a time. And all these things are going to happen when he who crushes the power of the holy people meets his end. I'll read it again. A time and 2 times and half a time, and all these things are going to happen when he who crushes the power of the holy people meets his end. Now, who was the power who was going to crush the holy people? Because the times and a half was the time stated that he who crushes the holy people would come to his end. Now, if you remember from last time, if we go back to Daniel and we come back to Daniel chapter 8, you remember we looked from Matthew chapter 24 concerning the abomination that maketh desolate. And in verse 23, in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentence he shall stand up. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy wonderfully and shall prosper and practice and destroy the mighty and the holy people. Now, what power, therefore, was to destroy the mighty and the holy people? The abomination that maketh desolate that stood in the holy place. That's what we saw from Matthew 24. And there's only one power who crushed God's people, and that was the Romans. And in AD 70, it was the power of the Romans who obviously crushed God's people. Now, just to tie up your references, just go to Matthew 24 and just take a look again. The Master was describing the downfall of the temple when it was going to be taken down brick by brick. And we find in verse 14, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached into all the world. And Paul, writing Colossians chapter 1, tells us the gospel was preached in all the world as a sign of the end of Judah's commonwealth, for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, then the end would come. And the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel was this great and dreadful fourth beast who was going to prosper to destroy God's holy people. He was going to take away the holy place and scatter the people. Now, when you come back to Daniel chapter 12, Daniel was saying, I'll read it from the Jerusalem again, all these things are going to happen when he who crushes the power of the holy people meets his end. When that Roman power was going to lose its power. Then, Daniel says, that is one of the signs that the end is to come. So do we take then that the end of the Roman power was in AD 476 when the western part went? Or do we take it in 1453 when the eastern part went? Or when was the destruction? When was the downfall? When was the fulfillment of verse 7? Well, let's bear in mind back Daniel chapter 7. Because Daniel chapter 7 states times and a half. Times and a half. Now in Daniel chapter 7, is he considering the Roman beast which he destroyed God's people in AD 70? Or is Daniel in chapter 7 showing the development of that same beast? Well, verse 8 has told us. And verse 24 is explained to us. It's the development of that same beast which is referred to in Daniel 7. It's the extension out of the Roman Empire of the religious power which dominated the earth after Rome as a military power ceased to be. What Daniel chapter 7 is telling us is that the Roman power and influence continued for many a long year after both the western and eastern part of the Roman Empire came to nothing. Daniel is showing that under the power of the papacy, Rome was to extend its influence for many years after the Roman military power came to an end. And in verse 25 we're told that this power that would arise shall speak great words against the Most High, shall wear out the saints of the Most High for this period of time, at times, and the dividing of a time. Now we've got to bring Daniel 12 and Daniel chapter 7 together. The base is Rome. The destruction of God's people in AD 70 was the abomination that was to make desolate Rome. Rome at that time as a military force, as the dreadful and terrible beast with his great iron claws which break everything before him. That was Rome. But Rome was to continue. Rome was to develop into perhaps even a more powerful force than had been seen before. Because this time he was to speak blasphemy against the Most High. He was to wear out the saints of the Most High. He was to defy the living God. Now Rome before that couldn't care less about the God of Israel. Rome before that had got no religious inclinations whatsoever. But since Constantine had come on the scene, Rome had developed into a Christian state. A state church had been declared. And that state church was to take the influence of Rome into far greater places than the Roman power had ever been before, because it was going to penetrate the very hearts and minds of men and women. And it was going to extend its influence down the ages of time until the times and a half was to come to an end. Now that was not going to be the end of all things. That was not going to be the destruction of that power, but their influence of changing laws, of wearing out the saints of the Most High God, of changing times, that would come to an end. The time when they would be able to exert the power which they had done before would come to an end. Now if we come back to Apocalypse chapter 12, we've now got to bring the thoughts of Apocalypse 12 into line with what Daniel has told us. It must relate to the same period of history and to have a common subject. So in verse 14, to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished for a time, times and half the time from the face of the serpent. So the times and a half was the length of period that this woman was going to be protected to a degree from the face of the serpent. Why should she need to be protected from the face of the serpent? Surely, to quote a famous brother, surely the serpent has been destroyed. Because if we go back in the 12th chapter of the Apocalypse, we find in verse 9, the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan. Now we identified that at the time as being the overthrow of paganism by the champion of the Christian cause, Constantine. We found in verse 7 that Michael was to destroy the power of the dragon. And that dragon is styled the old serpent, and therefore with the victory of Constantine, the old serpent must have been destroyed. And yet, when we come to verse 14, we find that the woman community need to be sustained, to be nourished for this same period of a times and a half from the face of the serpent. So what's the Spirit saying? That paganism revised? By no means. Christianity took over the Roman Empire. What it is telling us as we go forward in verse 15 and verse 17, The serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood, that he might cause the woman to be carried away of the flood. And we find in verse 17, the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with her and with them who keep the commandments of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. So we've got the same mention of the serpent and the dragon as we'd got in the earlier verses of the chapter. And we'd identified that with the power of Rome, pagan in origin. And therefore we are being taught to appreciate that the Roman power has continued. The Roman power, a dragon before was a dragon after. It was the great and dreadful beast of Daniel 7. It was still Rome. The change had been prior to the uprise of Christianity. Rome was pagan, and therefore rightly described as the dragon, the old serpent, the devil and Satan. And we saw the link back to the serpent in the garden, which beguiled Eve from the truth. But now, Christianized Rome was equally as bad in its persecution of the woman as the predecessor of paganism had been. Military might of Rome never ceased for a period of time. So although Constantine came to the throne, although the empire became, in quote, Christianized, the power that was Rome was to continue. And therefore in verse 14, the face of the serpent and the dragon of verse 16 and 17 was Rome after Constantine had ascended to his power. Because he was to persecute the Protestants, those who opposed his edict, as powerfully and resourcefully as the pagans had done before him. There was no difference. Emperor Constantine was no better for his conversion than the emperors before him or after him. Rome was still that great and dreadful beast who would oppose anyone who stood in his way. And although now it become more of a religious matter rather than a military one, it was still nevertheless a persecutor of those who opposed its edicts. And therefore it was necessary in the purpose of God, coming back to verse 14, for this woman community to be nourished from the power that was Rome for this period of time, of a time, times, and half the time. Now you'll notice in verse 17, the dragon makes war. He was wrong. He makes war with the woman and with the true ecclesia of Christ. Now if you look back to Daniel chapter 7, what does Daniel chapter 7 tell us that was going to happen at the time when Rome changed from being a military power purely and simply into a powerful empire still, but now with a horn which was to speak against the Most High? We find in verse 25, he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws. He shall wear out the saints of the Most High. And again, if I might quote you from the Jerusalem Bible, it says here, he will consider changing seasons and laws, and the saints will be put into his power. The saints will be put into his power. He shall wear out the saints of the Most High. He makes war against them. He was wroth with them. And this was to continue for times and a half. So when did it end? When did it begin? Well, the answer must be the same in Daniel 7, Daniel 12, and Apocalypse 12. It's the same time period, and therefore it relates to the same period of history and to have a common subject. Now, we've seen, as we've looked back to chapter 11, we've seen various dates before. We've seen the 42 months. We've seen the 1260 days. We've seen the beginnings and the endings of these things. So what is the beginning and the ending of the times and a half? Well, when did the religious power of Rome lose its power? When did Rome, under its religious guise, Daniel 7, it had gone from just a dreadful beast to this little horn that had come out of it. When did Rome, as a religious power, lose its force? When did it cease to influence laws and times? When did it cease to wear out the saints of the Most High God? When did it become, almost as it were, a powerless community? Well, of course, history, and recent history as far as we're concerned, testifies to the end of the temporal power of the papacy in the year 1870. And of course, as most of you will probably recall, it was at the time when Brother Thomas felt that the power of the papacy would fall, that the Messiah would come. And he felt that in AD 1870, when Rome was to lose its temporal power, and the Emperor of Italy, the ruler of Italy, was to take over the lands which had belonged previously to the papacy, and all the papacy owns now as far as territory is concerned is the 1 mile square Vatican City, then Brother Thomas felt on the basis of Daniel 12 that Messiah would come. But of course Daniel 12 didn't give us the coming of Messiah. Daniel 12 gave us events which would expire, which would herald the coming of Messiah. And 1870 was one of those events which would herald the coming of Messiah. Now, if you go back into history, you will find that from 1866, through a series of problems, eventually culminating in 1870, Rome was to lose its temporal power. Now, if we work back from that date, the times, and half a time, and work back to 1260, what do we come to? We come to the year AD 610. And what happened in the year AD 610? When the infallibility of the papacy was at last ratified by Emperor Phocas. I'll quote you from Times and Seasons by W.H. Bolton. And he says, Justinian, in the year AD 533, was to acknowledge the Pope as the universal bishop of the state church. The Pope was to be acknowledged as the universal bishop of the state church. That was in the year AD 533. But the absolute authority of the Pope as the head of the Catholic Church and as the bishop throughout the world was not confirmed until Phocas, that's Emperor Phocas, in the year 610. And it was Emperor Phocas who instituted the infallibility of the Pope. And he decreed that whatever the Pope said was true, that the Pope could never be wrong. And the Catholic Church obviously was then all-powerful. And from AD 610, although it had been growing, it had obviously existed since the days of AD 312 with Constantine. It was in AD 610, under the decree of Emperor Phocas, that the papacy was given its complete authority. And if you take that 1260 from AD 610, we come to the year, remarkably enough, to AD 1870, when the papacy lost its temporal power. Now, if you consider chapter 7, chapter 12 of Daniel, and Apocalypse chapter 12, you will find that all these things are relating to the same thing. Daniel chapter 7 is speaking of the little horn who would war against the Most High in the fact of wearing out the saints of the Most High. He would cause all sorts of things to happen until a time and times and the dividing of the time. And one would assume that that should have been the end of the papacy, but Daniel tells us that it's not. Verse 26. But the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion. And that's exactly what they did. They took away his dominion, but to consume and to destroy it unto the end. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom of the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominion shall serve and obey him. It wasn't to be destroyed one and the same time. They were to take away his dominion at the end of a time, times, and a dividing of the time, for the purpose that eventually they would consume it at the end of the time. And at the end of the time was the end of the time what Daniel makes reference to in chapter 12. Daniel first of all wanted to see the taking away of the power who would destroy God's people. Must be religious because of what he said in chapter 7. And then in verse 8, when he's seen the times and a half come to a completion, he then wanted to know, but when shall be the end of these things? Okay, they're going to have their power taken away. They're going to lose their dominion. But when will they be eventually destroyed? In other words, he wanted an enlargement of Daniel 7. He knew that the times and a half wouldn't come to the end of the destruction of that power. It would simply take away its dominion. He wanted now, in verse 8, to see what the end of these things would be. And of course, he was then told in verse 11 that from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate shall be set up, there shall be 1,290 days. But go thy way. And in verse 12, blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,335 days, and then go thy way till the end be. So he was then given 2 more time periods, 1290 and 1335, which would be significant along the way until the end be. And Daniel was not told when the end of all things would be. Now we shall look at the 1290 and 1335 later on in our study of the Apocalypse. But it's right to remember that the times and a half is not taking us to the end of all things. It's not taking us to the destruction of that Roman power. It's taking us to when his dominion would be taken away, when he would lose his power and his authority. And that happened, I would suggest to you, in 1870, when Rome lost its temporal power. Now if you look back to chapter 12 of the Apocalypse, you will notice what was going to happen here. The serpent in verse 15, the serpent, now the pseudo-Christianized Roman power, but still serpent-like. The serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman. Now water as a flood is spoken of earlier in the scriptures. I mean, just go to Jeremiah 46, for example, and you will see what the symbology of water as a flood is all about. Jeremiah 46. And in verse 7, who is this that cometh up as a flood, whose waters are moved as the rivers? Egypt riseth up like a flood, and his waters are moved like rivers. And he said, I will go up, and will cover the earth. I will destroy the city and the inhabitants thereof. And here, obviously, Jeremiah was prophesying the overthrow of the army of Egypt by Nebuchadnezzar. And therefore he describes the army of Egypt as he that cometh up as a flood, whose waters are moved as the rivers. And it was the invading army of the Egyptians who eventually were going to be destroyed by the Babylonians. And that's exactly the symbology we've got in verse 15, that the serpent, the Roman power, Constantine in control, cast out of his mouth water as a flood. And it spoke of the armies which he used, obviously, to try and quell the dissension that had occurred. And he caused this to go after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. But in verse 16, the earth helped the woman. And the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. If the sun, moon and stars of the heavenlies relate to those who are ruling in the political heavens, those of the earth relate to those who are ruled over. Isaiah chapter 1, give ear, O heavens, and hear, O earth, what Yahweh has spoken. It relates to those who are the rulers, the heavens, and those who are ruled over the earth. And therefore some of the earth's people were to help the woman resist the power of the armies of Rome who were seeking her destruction. Now how was that to come about? Do you remember the two witnesses of Revelation 11? In verse 2, the court which was without the temple leave out, and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months. And what did we see as the beginning and the ending of the 14 months? What's the time period of the 14 months? Why were they to tread under the holy city for that period? And what was to resist them? Verse 3, I will give power unto my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy the 1260 days, clothed in sackcloth. And you remember at the time of Apocalypse chapter 11, we explained and showed from the scriptures that these two witnesses of chapter 11 were to equate and represent the earth and the woman of Apocalypse chapter 12. It was those of the earth, i.e. the people of the Empire of Rome, who felt that the cause of Constantine against this religious element was unjust. And therefore they helped in a military way the cause of the woman in stopping the persecution by Constantine of the religious element. And therefore the earth of verse 16 of chapter 12 we looked at, if you remember, in detail when we did the two witnesses. And we saw that the two witnesses were there for what reason? To protect the ecclesia of God. They were there to allow the ecclesia of God to continue. Because the dragon in verse 17 was wrath, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. And the two witnesses were appointed by God, not because they were two, as we saw, there were many of them. But these two witnesses, representing the earth and the woman, were to succor the ecclesia of God. Because don't forget, the woman was not the ecclesia of God. The woman was obviously Christian, because she brought forth the man-child. She became Protestant in opposing the Catholic doctrines of Constantine, but she didn't hold the truth. She didn't keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. And therefore we saw in chapter 11 the distinction between the two witnesses and the holy city. The holy city was the remnant of verse 17. The holy city was the true ecclesia. That which was offering her protection from the onslaught of the Roman power was the earth and the woman. And Constantine wanted to destroy all religious opposition to him. And some of that opposition came from the woman itself, part of the woman who had disagreed with his edicts over the African controversy, but separate and distinct from it, but still very much opposing the edict of Rome, was the true ecclesia, the holy city, which they persecuted and trod down, those which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. And so chapter 12, as well as enlarging upon the sixth seal of the sixth chapter, is also dovetailing the details for us of the 11th chapter with the two witnesses. It's the same persecution brought by the same power, and the ecclesia was sustained until that power had its dominion taken away. And when that dominion was taken away, then it was a herald to the coming of Messiah at the end of the day, when, as chapter 17 and 18 will tell us, he will completely and forever destroy the power of the papacy. But we have got to remember that today the Roman Catholic Church has got no temporal power. We have got to remember that today the Roman Catholic Church has got no influence to change times and laws. And thanks be to God, today the Roman Catholic Church does not wear out the saints of the Most High God. That time has come to an end. Rome, as a religious force, was to continue, but again in a different way. And the 17th and 18th chapter will tell us the different way in which Rome was to continue. But we have got to remember that when it's coming to an end of a period, it's not coming to the end of all things when Messiah would appear. It's for a purpose, for a reason. But we've got to make the distinctions in our minds of the difference between the one set and the other set and the end of all things. And so the times and a half, was when Rome was to lose this dominion, this temporal power, in order for the things which he had been doing for so many long years to come to an end. And so the end might eventually come. And so chapter 12 has given us the extension of chapter 6 and chapter 11 in explaining the beginning of the development of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, if I can take you back in conclusion to the notes we compiled right at the beginning. I don't know if any of you have brought them along. But you will notice under chapter 12 we've got the beginning of what became known as the Holy Roman Empire. And just to sum up what we said of chapter 12, chapter 12 shows the development of the Roman Catholic system, ultimately in the person of Constantine, the man-child. In Revelation chapter 2 and verse 20, ecclesias had tolerated the woman Jezebel, who related to a class of heretics which showed the early developments of the great harlot system. The woman of the chapter symbolises the same system, Roman Catholicism in the intermediate state of her development. And then we gave the breakdown of the verses. And you will notice from verses 13 to 17, which we have been looking at tonight, it's the persecution of the Protestants because of their objection to the decrees which Constantine had established. And so we will move on next time, God willing, to chapter 13. And chapter 13 we will see the involvement of this religious system which had now been started until it was to grow and develop into that great Catholic system which we only know of too well. And chapter 13 is going to show us the development of this system until it became the Holy Roman Empire. So I know we've been again looking at a lot of history, but I trust we might look at it, analyse, compare all the references to see the way Scripture is indicating differing time periods by the use of the symbols, so that we may put together those which are like symbols, that we may appreciate they are speaking of the same thing.